So good morning. I welcome everyone to this third panel on food security in Africa. It's a pleasure for me to moderate this session. I am Ainhoa Marín. I work as a senior analyst for Elcano Institute, Elcano Royal Institute based in Madrid. Elcano is also a member, I think the most recent member of the European think tanks group. So I take the chance to thank ETTG and also ECDPM for inviting me to moderate this panel on behalf of my institution. I also want to thank Fabrizio Botti here with us also, who is the co-author of the keynote that supports this session. I think from time to time they put this QR code so you can scan the document directly. And so I've been told by the organization to remind that the document is accessible online through the QR. Food security, as we know, yes. Okay, thank you. Food security, as we know, is a paramount issue for Africa. It was worsening well before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the consequences of the war are triggering more attention on the problem. Of course, we have to say that we all know that there are multiple drivers and causes of food insecurity. Of course, it's climate change. We've heard a lot about it in the previous session, and its consequences, short rainfall, flooding, and other natural shocks. But there are also other causes like conflict, instability. We have to say also lack of political will sometimes in some African countries to react on time when they see the problem coming. Of course, the war in Ukraine has resulted in higher food inflation and also a rise in the price of fertilizers. So to talk about all these issues that seem to be sometimes simple, but they are not, let me welcome and introduce the four panelists that are here to discuss today. First, let me introduce Elizabeth Nsimadala, here on my left. Elizabeth is an Ugandan young farmer and agripreneur, president of the Eastern Africa Farmers Federation. She's the current director, Women Affairs, and immediate past president at Pan-Africa Farmers Organization, and also she's in the Africa board representative of the World Farmers Organization. Elizabeth holds many other roles and responsibilities at global, continental, regional, and national level. She's that part I really like. She's a passionate cooperator and farmer who has been at the forefront of the championing digitalization of the agriculture sector. So thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us today to share your first-hand expertise and views with all of us. In the second place, I would like to introduce Bettina. Bettina should be here. Hello. Because she's connecting, joining us remotely. There.
Hello.
Yes, we can't hear you, but we see you. Bettina Rudloff, I will present you. She's an agricultural engineer and holds a PhD on trade economics. Currently, she's a senior associate at the German Institute of International and Security Affairs at Berlin and carries research and consultancy on trade and development and geostrategic aspects of food security. She was an assistant professor at the University of Bonn in Germany. She worked at the European Institute for Public Administration in the Netherlands, and she led their trainings on behalf of the DG Trade for WTO negotiators on developing countries. So, Bettina, thank you for taking part in this roundtable and joining us from Berlin. Our third speaker is Evelien. Sitting there in the middle, Evelien van Roemburg. Evelien is the head of Oxfam International's EU office in Brussels. She heads a team of 30 colleagues focusing on research, policy, communications, and funding, targeting EU institutions in Brussels as well at the OECD in Paris. The European Office of Oxfam works on a large number of topics, including development cooperation, humanitarian action, tax, migration, health, climate, and food security also, of course. Evelien has a PhD in international law and international organizations. She was a Fulbright scholar and holds 3 master's degrees in law and political science. Evelien, thank you for being here today and sharing Oxfam's position. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And finally, on the left, I would like to present Leonard Mizzi. Leonard is the head of unit at the European Commission. DG for International Partnerships, Sustainable Agri-Food Systems and Fisheries since 2017. Prior to this post, he was head of unit 14 years in DG Agriculture and Rural Development. He is a graduate in public administration from the University of Malta and holds a PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Reading in the UK. He has been an author of a number of articles and publication of agri-food issues and nutrition in the Mediterranean region. So thank you for being here with us and giving this fundamental vision from the European Commission in this roundtable. So before we start the interventions, just let me remind you some quick notes, tips for the session. You are kindly asked to answer briefly, no, after each question, maybe a round of 3 or 4 minutes. And of course, whenever you feel that you need to ask for the floor to react to any of the other interventions, feel free to do that. Or maybe you want to just comment on some points raised by other members and so on. So feel free to do that also. No? And finally, as it happened on the other session, I will open the floor for a 30-minute round of questions coming from the audience, also the online chat. And we will also, well, so we'll collect I think at the same time, all the questions coming from the audience and online, and you will finally have a final round to answer to the questions and also to maybe make some final key messages. And so let's start with a round of questions. My first question, it's about first, if you could give us a short diagnosis of food security problem in Africa, short diagnosis about causes, but the second part is you could also give us some solutions, because I think these two go linked. I mean, you identify these problems and you give different type of solutions, no? So they go all together. The third part of this question, first part is causes, second part is solutions, is about the role of the European Union, no? In this, if you can give us or you can share your comments on this issue. So this is like a triple question about causes, solutions, and EU role. I know it's not very easy, but if you could be brief, because afterwards we can dig into more deeply and specifically in some other solutions, no, related to internal characteristics of the African food market. So let's start, I don't know, maybe with Elizabeth. No, I think I warned you, you were going to be the first one. So Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity and for inviting farmers to be part of this discussion. So I bring you greetings from the Pan-Africa Farmers Organization, an institution that has a footprint in 50 countries of Africa, representing over 80 million smallholder farmers, and also the region organization, Eastern Africa Farmers Federation, in 10 countries of Eastern Africa, 25 million smallholder farmers from 25 national level farmers organizations. That is the constituency that I represent and bring their voice in this room. So back to the question, I think for the longest time, as Africa, we thought we had enough capacity to feed ourselves, because we know over 60% of arable land is in Africa. But when you look at the situation at hand, I think the reality is different. And this is because most of the African countries are really grappling with macroeconomic challenges. And these challenges are as a result of, the different shocks. Shocks from the climate, both in terms of extreme shocks, cold and dry shocks, but also in terms of insecurity, political insecurity across many different countries. But also when you look at the impact of COVID-19 and other impacts. Of course, these have caused a lot of food insecurity within the continent. But then in terms of what is happening, there are several initiatives at Africa level. And of course, these initiatives are around enabling policy environment, but also investments in the agriculture sector. When I take you to the regional economic communities, for example, the Eastern Africa bloc, where I come from, We have the Food Security and Nutrition Plan. And this plan is speaking about creating food reserves at national, but also at regional level. And when you look at countries that have been doing this, like India, that has been doing this for the last, I think, about 4 decades, you can see that much as they are faced with food insecurity challenges, they are able to mitigate with less effort. So the key thing, or what I would propose, is that we need to implement some of these policies, make sure that we have national food reserves and also regional food reserves, but not only looking at the national and the regional ones, but then move these reserves to the ground level where the rubber meets the road. At the farm level, we need to have investments in food reserves at the farm level. Again, I want to highlight the importance of agriculture, water, or water for production. When you look at Africa in general, most of our agriculture is rain-fed. So then less investments in water for irrigation. We are not good at harvesting it, extraction, but also storage. Actually, it's very surprising that at times when it rains, you'll see that it will rain for about 5 or 8 or 10 hours. But 30 minutes after it has stopped raining, you will see kids going to the streams to follow the same running water that is on, down in the streams to fetch water for home or domestic use. So we need to see a lot of investments being made in terms of water for production at national and also subnational and community level. The other issue that I want to point out is on agro-processing. When you look at the exports that Africa exports to the rest of the world, including Europe, it is mostly in raw form. So we need to see investments in the agro-processing and value addition so that we can, have an equal share when it comes to the market. And once we develop this, processing sector, that's when we can have a say in the market. But also, in relation to that, we need to have balanced world trade agreements in terms of, agro-processed products. Of course, once we have a leveled ground in terms of world trade agreements, it will also create opportunities for manufacturing investments in Africa. And then last on that is at the production level, we need to see policy reforms in drought-tolerant nutritious crop varieties. There's a lot of research that is happening at national level and also regional level, but most of this research is done in silos. It ends up in those research centers. So we need to see a shift of moving this research to the ground, to the farms where it is needed. We need to have proper selection, for example, of which varieties and where they can do well. And then also in terms of capacity building of the farmers who are going to, scale up some of these researches. But also in terms of identifying the right enterprises based on the different locations. I give an example of a country like Kenya. It's very expensive, for example, to grow maize in Kenya compared to growing maize in Uganda. And that is why every time it's a maize season, there's always a distortion of the market in Kenya because it is cheaper to grow maize from Uganda and transport it in Kenya. So if we have the right policies.
Cheaper to produce maize in Kenya?
In Uganda.
In Uganda, why is it this labor cost? Or?
In Uganda, I think cost of labor, the cost of production, but also the climate. The climate is more favorable in Uganda, so we have more production. And then also the soils are still fertile. Farmers are using less in terms of fertilizer. And then in Kenya, they are using more fertilizer, which becomes more expensive, and the return on investments is very low. So then when you produce maize in Uganda, it is cheaper than producing from the same acreage in Kenya. And that's why there is always standoff when there's maize production. Kenya is always protecting its own market, and so it creates a lot of protectionism between the different countries. To address that, I think the different countries need to see it and see, for example, if it is cheaper to produce maize in Uganda, why should Kenya invest in the production of maize when they can get it cheaply from Uganda? The other day, I had the president of Kenya, the new president, Mr. Ruto, saying that if we can get cheap milk from Uganda, why does Kenya have to invest in the production of milk? Maybe we need to invest in variation so that we can export powdered milk and then take fresh milk from Uganda, and that really makes a lot of sense. So then it means countries like Kenya would invest in other sectors like, research and other areas which would also benefit the region. So back to the second one on the contribution of EU. I would say, of course, EU is making a lot of contribution to the agriculture sector in Africa in general. But this contribution, however, is not really creating like a lasting impact in the agriculture sector. And this is because we are really seeing a sinking situation into the food insecurity space. So probably we need to change the approach. When you look at the food import bill, currently some studies show that it's around 56 billion US dollars, which is of course very high. So this calls for a real look on how some of these investments are made in the agriculture sector in Uganda, in Africa in general. Take an example, maybe we could think of focusing more on the drivers of food security and support them independently. But also probably the EU needs to think about increasing the resource envelope, but also in terms of the period of support, because some of the projects are usually short-term and they don't create a long-term impact after the end of the project. And my last point is on us as farmers. Farmers are usually the ones that are most affected by all these issues that I talked about. We bear the brunt of all these challenges. But then when it comes to the support that we receive, we don't usually get direct support from EU. It is either through a back donor or it's either through a government. But then we've built enough internal capacity through our national farmers organization, regional farmers organizations, and continental farmers organizations, where we are very grateful for some of the programs like Farmers Organization for Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific, which is a continental program supported by EU and Organization of African Caribbean States. But then when you look at the management cost through, of course, the back donor or our governments, then most of the resources, of course, percentage of the resources that would have created impact end up in some of those structures. So if the resources are coming direct to the farmers' organizations, I think it would create a greater impact. So my call to action is, of course, to see how EU can really work directly with farmers. We could try it as a pilot and see whether it can work. And with that, of course, I want to end here and back to you, Madam. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for your highlights, and I'm sure Leonard will answer probably on the the ideas, and challenges you have posted regarding European Union's collaboration on food security. I would like to move now to our online panel, Bettina. Please, if you would like to comment on these issues. Thank you.
So first, I hope you can hear me. I have some audio problems. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we do.
Now
Maybe
you
we
can hear me. Okay.
Right.
Perfect. So thank you very much first for the organizers, ETTG and ACDPM, to having me at this very challenging and interesting and, of course, important panel on food security. Well, I thought to comment maybe on some let's say, general and meta level issues in terms of frame, again, what is happening actually now. And you said that in your introduction, of course, rightly. So the unfortunate Russian invasion in Ukraine and the war, of course, raised the awareness, which under experts like we all are, have been there already beforehand, of course, on food security. But it raised it to a more general foreign policy level, so to a real high priority issue. I was involved a lot in the German lead of the G7, and exactly in that period, this invasion happened. So all the G7 issues, which are generally very much overall security and foreign policy, were immediately linked to the questions on food security. So having said that, it's important first to see that the problem and the food security challenges already existed before this Russian war. So it's not only to avoid new food crisis, but actually to solve the existing ones first, because otherwise any additional future shock like this one now interrupting the international markets and the availability of food will lead to, again, certain price peaks. And we had that already in the past several times. So the last so-called price crisis was in 2011, and the one before in 2008, where we had historical price peaks. So what I wanted to say, there's of course a generalizing issue we have to consider and to react. And yeah, if one is working a long time in this issue, one is asking themselves, ourselves, why is that not working better? One problem which maybe is now very much at the focus is this kind of simultaneity of different crises. We have the long-term issues. We had that in the morning, the climate effects, which continuously affect food production. And we have always these in-between acute shocks, like there's a pandemic, or there's a certain natural disaster in a certain region, or there's a war. So, and for policymakers, it's of course different to tackle at the same time these long-lasting issues and the very acute ones, which then raise most policy awareness. So this is just to explain maybe the general challenge. I would like maybe add upon some issue. The colleague from Morocco has talked about elephants in the room. And I would like, for food security, address some other elephants in the room, which we all know. And the relation between EU-Africa has maybe to consider a larger scope, like, touching on other actors, which is Russia, which is China, which may be India as well in the future. And I'm talking about this larger arena, not only because of the recent war, but we know that the EU has to positioning itself towards Africa regarding aid. Who is doing what kind of aid on the African continent, which, by the way, of course, consists of a lot of very different countries with different interests and sensibilities. So how to positioning the EU in this concert with Russia, China, India as regards aid, as regards investments on agriculture, as regards trade. And we see it now very recently. Where are the trade flows coming to certain African countries? So the relation EU-Africa cannot forget the other actors. And there, I think it's that would be an observation and a wish as well. There's need for a clear debate between EU and Africa. What are as well the expectations from different African countries towards the EU compared to other actors? And maybe finally more specific, there are already a lot of cooperations, and Elizabeth has announced them. And they are first in the area of aid, so food aid, like emergency help, but as well longer term development aid with respect to food. There's a new idea born now during this crisis and led very much by the German government, but supported as well by the World Bank, which is the Global Alliance on Security of Food Systems, which should envelope a kind of dashboard, so kind of alert system where will be problems in the future, in what countries worldwide, not only Africa, and where are gaps. So to prepare, let's say, humanitarian aid to really fill certain gaps. So this is the area of aid. There's as well the area of trade or trade policy. I mean, there's this huge, enormous exercise within Africa, the African Free Continental area, sorry, AFCFTA. And there the question is, of course, how the EU and the existing bilateral and regional trade agreements vis-a-vis different regions and countries may support, at least not hinder, this regional approach in Africa. For instance, support the very complex issue of non-tariff measures. So all the quality structures, government structures on trade facilitation, and there are already trade facilitation programs to support that. What else? Whole transport logistics systems. So there should be, and there are different programs in different policy dimensions. EU, Africa, however, like always, they could be interlinked better. That functioned very well now in the recent crisis towards the war against the Ukraine and the question of how to get all the cereals to the international market. There was an enormous effort of the European Union to combine transport logistics, to combine trade rules, to combine infrastructure support and so on. But this should be, let's say, a general concept to intervene better all these existing policy frames. And I stop maybe here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Bettina. Thank you, Bettina, for bringing us again the idea of these different crises all together at the same time that was mentioned also yesterday in the opening session, and also the importance of other actors. No, we'll go back to other actors, especially Russia in the last question of the session. But yeah, let me move to Evelien. I think Oxfam has always been very critical, no, with EU policy in general and other aspects. So we expect a very frank, no.
I'll do my best.
Very frank intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks also first for organizing this very important panel and for having me on it. I really appreciate that. I want to build a little bit on what Bettina has been saying about the global systems in crises, in particular the global food system. But first, when we talk about a global food crisis, what we're actually talking about is hunger, right? And just a few numbers across 53 countries, so not just in Africa, almost 200 million people are suffering from acute hunger. And 48 million people in the Horn of Africa are in need of humanitarian aid. 26 million people in the Sahel are suffering from enormous droughts and are going hungry. And in Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, again, historic levels of drought is causing every 36 seconds one person to die. So we are really talking about a huge, huge crisis, and it's a hunger crisis. And I think it's important to say it like that. And what has already been said is that the war in Ukraine has made these crises worse, but it's not new. It's not a new crisis. It's an additional layer to a system that's not working. A system where we see that farmers all over the world are in principle producing enough food to feed the world, but it's people are unable to buy it because the prices are too high, or it's not distributed, so they are not able to reach the food, right? So The country director of Syria for Oxfam was in Brussels last month, talking about the Syria crisis to EU stakeholders, and he was mentioning to me that the food prices in Syria have risen with 92% in the past year, which means that people who are making 3 times the minimum wage in Syria are just not able to buy basic food supplies. So again, this is not just a crisis that's happening in Africa, but we do see that many African countries, particularly in the Horn and in the Sahel, are particularly affected, and that millions of people are going hungry or are at dangerous levels of famine. And at the same time, so we see this on the one hand, and at the same time we see that the broken food system is concentrating powers and profits in the hands of only a few. So since COVID, we've seen the enormous profits being made by only a few billionaires. So 62 new billionaires in the food and agriculture business in the past year, making a profit of 382 billion. So there's huge inequalities in the system, and I think it's very important to address that. So it's, and we also see very large agri-food companies making profits, like Cargill, who has made last year the highest profit ever. So there's again this huge inequality. And we also see that in terms of market control, with 1% of the farmers having access or owning 65% of all the farmland in the world. So this makes low-income countries in particular extremely vulnerable for shocks like the one that's happening now as a result of the crisis in Ukraine, and very dependent on the global food system that is not working. So in order to address that, I think we cannot continue with the same approaches as we've been implemented in the past years. We really need to address these huge inequalities in the system. Short term, that means increasing humanitarian aid. We see also there an inequality, of course, with the crisis in Ukraine getting a lot of attention and also a lot of funding, whereas the funding appeals for many of the humanitarian crises, in particular the Horn of Africa and the Sahel, are not being met at all, not even 50%. So we really see a dire need in terms of short solution to address that. And also what we have seen and what's quite positive is this windfall tax on energy, huge energy profits, but we need that also for other sectors, including the agribusiness. So with these extra income, we would be able to really invest in social security, in addressing inequalities through social protection schemes. So that's another thing that could be done in the short term. But then in the long term, what we need to do is really make sure that we invest in sustainable domestic and local food production in low-income countries, so that they're not so vulnerable to these external shocks, and that farmers like Elizabeth can really thrive and make sure that food is being produced there where it's also used. So more access to funding, more access to infrastructure and to markers for farmers in these low-income countries. And we also have to act much, much earlier, and that's something that Bettina also already mentioned, because when the humanitarians arrive, the crisis is already on their way, the conflict or the hunger is already happening. So really investing in development, in addressing inequalities, in making sure that health and education, social protection, all of that is being addressed so that we don't end up in these kind of crises. And then, well, maybe I'll leave what the EU can do to the next round of interventions.
Thank you, Evelien. Thank you for pointing out the inequalities of the system, and also, well, making this a necessary difference between short-term measures and long-term solutions. Leonard, so I give you the floor so you can comment, maybe even react to some of the interventions of the previous panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, and first of all, thanks for the organizers to put food security high on the agenda. I converge with all what Elizabeth, Evelien, and Bettina said. Just some points. The figures were mentioned. I will not mention again the figures. Just to make a clarification with Elizabeth, the import bill of sub-Saharan Africa, food import bill, is around 60 billion. This is a figure that came out from the FAO Food Outlook report. I'm speaking here about sub-Saharan Africa, not the Egypts and the Algerias of this world. That will be even higher. So clearly, a first priority of the EU, and this is part of our communication since March, June Council conclusions, and what has been announced with the 8 billion portfolio that we have, including with the humanitarian portfolio and the international partnerships and DGNR portfolio, is 8 billion enough? Because here in Brussels, we tend to always speak, and this is also mea culpa and the culpa of the Commission services, money talks, important, but this is not enough. And this is not about money only, because we can speak about money and billions, fine. But I think what Elizabeth said is important, and what Bettina said. Let's start, geopolitical. Whoever compares food to the issue of COVID and vaccines, I think there is no corollary. We can't do what we have been doing for vaccines because there is no vaccine for food security. There is no vaccine. I can't do a manufacturing plant to solve what we have been trying to solve in COVID with the complexities that we are discussing here. Okay? Food systems are complex. Food systems are wide. What Elizabeth mentioned, just mentioning one, maize. First of all, we don't have a fora. Bettina mentioned GAFS, Global Alliance. I think every week I would have between 5 and 10 meetings, GAFS and UN Crisis Response Group, and this and that, fine. And CADEP this week, Elizabeth. Every day I have CADEP. But the problem is we have lots of meetings, we have lots of plans, and what I'm trying to convey within a Team Europe approach is we need to have smart policies. I don't have more plans or implementation plans. It's smart policies. If Africa doesn't decide, and it's African-driven within CADEP, what priorities we need to focus on, there is a lot of distortion of policies that we can't continue accompanying. Let's start with issues around unsustainable subsidies on heavy fertilizer use. This is a problem. And this is a bit the geopolitical game or battle we have, because there are a lot of models out there competing on different policy options, which operators in Africa can pick and choose, but they are distortive and non-compatible. So what China, Russia, Gulf, sometimes Turkey, US, and EU proposes, they are not always converging on the ground. Clearly, they are not converging. And that is one of the big challenges that the EU and Team Europe has to operate on the ground. Whether we speak about GM, whether we speak about use of fertilizer synthetics, whether we use about sustainability, because it's good to speak about sustainability of food systems. That is what we are proposing. You know that we propose an approach which is transformative, inclusive, agroecology approach. You linking fertilizer use, we're not saying not to use fertilizers, but using fertilizers, linking to soil fertility and not pumping synthetic fertilizers where the soils are dead. So you can't just have a silver bullet, which, first of all, we have 50 countries which are clearly distinct. Evelien, if I speak about Somalia, it is not Cote d'Ivoire, it is not Kenya, it is not South Africa. So again, we have to be specific, country specific, but I can't be country specific if I want to solve the 60 billion problem, because the 60 billion problem, I can't just go in 50 countries and start saying, Somalia, I have to do this. We do this, but it's not going to be transformational. It's business as usual of 10, 15 years ago and trying to patch. We can't continue patching because patching 2022 is different from what Bettina was mentioning in terms of the economic crisis of 2007. And I was on this side of the house in Agri, when we had, if many of you recall, the L'Aquila process, where there was a big pumping of money, but billions and billions. What we're confronting in 2022, it is even more complicated than 2008. Much more complicated. I'm not speaking just about the aggression of Russia and the protraction of the crisis, but it is the accumulation of what Elizabeth mentioned, COVID. Okay. Then we had the issue of the war, which created shocks in wheat and maize. Okay, we have the solidarity lanes. I don't need to repeat the Black Sea Initiative. All this is working fine. The moment that the Black Sea Initiative had a shock, you had volatility of prices. The moment that this was restored, grain prices calmed down. But what is clear, that it can't be just INTPA or the money of INTPA or NIER or ECHO which will solve the problem. This is going to be a problem of a financial magnitude that requires also the financial institutions, the IMF, and also the macroeconomic balancing. You can't solve the food crisis if you don't tackle the macroeconomic crisis, because the macroeconomic crisis is creating shocks. What's happening in Nigeria, what's happening in Ghana with a devaluation of the exchange rates, which clearly makes their imports much more expensive. Despite oil production of some of the countries, these are not benefiting from the benefits because there are logistical problems, complicated problems around oil and gas in some of the Western African countries. You have high inflationary pressures, which you need to calm down clearly. And clearly, what we are trying to signal is focus more on strategic autonomy and production systems. But Elizabeth, when I have been doing some work on agricultural value chains in our portfolio, and we have to make a decision because my political masters tell me you need to make a political decision whether we work on 15 value chains in one country or we work with 2 value chains in one country to be really be impactful. Because what I'm doing, or what we are doing as member states today, we do a bit of everything. Because that is the reality in all your countries. So one day I tell you, and which is true, I do a lot of aquatic in a number of your countries, small island states. Aquatic is very important. I also do a lot of agropastoralism, important. I do a lot of cocoa in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Cameroon. I do a lot of coffee. But I can't do a bit of this, a bit of that, and then say that I can be impactful. So one of the decisions that I have to take with you as African Union is prioritization. Simple economics for those who are in economics, competitive and comparative advantage. Your maize case is classical. But what is Africa doing? Everyone is doing maize. Okay, maize might not be the smart approach, but everyone is doing maize. Or now it's trendy to be everyone does wheat because of what is happening. The question is, can Africa or North Africa all do wheat? Okay. And then we leave livestock, agropastoralism aside, aquatic aside, fruit and vegetables, then we'll see. We have issues around SPS issues, you know. So we are supporting you on SPS issues. But you know as well that what we want to do, you mentioned farmers' organizations, and you know that it's not always easy to work with farmers' organizations across all the continent. That's why we work with EFAD, and EFAD is your entry point to support farmers' organizations. We want to support you, continue supporting you, continue supporting gender transformative approaches, supporting smart value chains, but with a prioritization exercise. Continue supporting small ticket sizes in terms of de-risking financial institutions, because that's also not a given. Financial institutions don't want to invest in agriculture because it's complicated. So the European Union enters with small ticket sizes with high transaction costs, because operating in ticket sizes of 500,000, 800,000, 1 million is not easy compared to what many financial institutions, which I don't mention, but you know them, want to operate with 5, 10, 15, 20 million. It's easier. But the risking that is what we are doing part of our EDF, the commitments with IFAD. So we identify smaller ticket sizes through public development banks, but this is very time consuming because we go into small ticket sizes to benefit small farmers and small operators, which really need the most help today.
Thank you. I think maybe Elizabeth wants to react, no? She's been...
Yeah, thank you very much. And I really want to agree with the contributions from the various speakers, from Evelien, Bettina, and the last submission from Leonard. And like I said, I started by appreciating the support that we are really receiving from EU. It's one of the, I would say, institutions that have supported farmers' organizations that believe in farmers' organizations, of course, through IFAD. And what you highlighted in terms of the whole shopping list of the enterprises that our countries really want to invest in is a reality of what is happening in most of our African countries. When I look at, for example, the number of enterprises, the farmers' organizations in a country like Uganda, where I come from, you realize that based on the different agroecological zones, almost every agroecological zone has maybe 2 or 3 priority enterprises. So when you put them together, you realize that you have maybe 15 or 20 priority enterprises from different corners of the country. But I think it's high time we begin prioritizing enterprises that are competitive on the global market, but that also brings high returns in terms of investments. And this should be done at continental, but also bring it down to national level. Recently, I think it's about 3 weeks ago, FAO launched one country, one product initiative, which is identifying one commodity per country, and it's an investment program that FAO wants to invest in. And I believe it's also going to be like, you know, a gateway towards exploiting Africa Continental Free Trade Area, because if each country then has a priority enterprise that it's dealing in, it means it has a comparative advantage over the rest of the countries, and then it can put a lot of investment in such kind of commodity. I agree that EU, of course, is supporting different enterprises, as highlighted by Leonard, and again, we appreciate that. Of course, it's also a bit difficult and challenging to be almost in every sector, but that is the complexity of the agriculture sector, and then we have no alternative or shortcut to that. We have at least to try as much as possible to narrow the support to enterprises that are giving let's say benefits to majority of the population, but also make sure that some of those I would say, which right term should I use? The forgotten. Yeah, we also need to look at some of those forgotten enterprises that are also a priority to some of our countries. He also pointed out the issue of logistics, which is of course very critical if we are to have effective trading, for example, within our continent, but also between Africa and Europe. There is need to have a clear logistic system. When you look at, for example, trading within our continent, it's at times it's very expensive to move goods from a country like Uganda to, let's say, the neighboring 2 countries than moving the same product to Europe. So which makes it a little bit challenging, and this is where we need clear policies that are targeted towards, you know, improving the enabling environment within our continent. If we are talking about borderless trading, then there should not be any shortcut to that, but we should try and as much as possible to address all those non-tariff barriers that exist and make sure that we create a flawless trading environment within the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think we've already moved into many other questions that were supposed to appear, but I would like to focus more on this idea of strengthening regional value chains. I don't know if this is a specialized pattern, maybe is the best option or not, but in the case of the African continent, there is this one key instrument of the African Union, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area. I think it was Bettina who mentioned it earlier. No? And so talking about African, the CFTA, do you think this is a valuable instrument, a key instrument to make African markets more resilient? Because we are talking all the time about external shocks and many crises, and at the end, these internal markets need to be more resilient. Again, this crisis would probably in the future going to happen again, no? In another sense, another type, or coming from other factors, but they're going to be there. No? So the first key idea is to make African markets more resilient. So in that sense, what is the role to play of the Continental African Free Trade Agreement? And also at the same time, thinking not only from the inside, but more from the outside, there is also this idea of diversification of food suppliers. No? Before the idea of autosufficiency is more fulfilled, the idea of food external suppliers, and how could the European Union and Africa cooperate in this sense? Talking again about the CFTA, it is also true that when the African companies and the African countries will fulfill this objective of trading Africa, trading more with Africa, this, I think, in my opinion, it goes against the interest of European companies, because as far as you make Africa trade more with Africa, then you're trading less with the European Union. No? So this is an idea that it's in the background and it's not so often mentioned. No? So, well, I think I've posed many ideas, and maybe we can start with Bettina. I think has been working and doing research on regional value chains, although we've moved already on that part. So Bettina, maybe you can share some comments, please.
Yes, thank you very much.
Please, sorry to interrupt, but we're not very well on time. That's my fault. So if you could be brief, I would appreciate it.
I do. Of course, a regional market will be, how to say, relevant for the regionalization of African food security. 2 points to make on that. That's a long way still to go. So it's just at the very, very, very beginning, although a lot of African countries, nearly all, not completely all, but nearly all, have not only signed and ratified, but as well ratified. But it will take a long time. Why? Because we are not talking only about tariffs, which is the easiest way. We talk about all these non-tariff issues, logistics, and so on. So that's just at the beginning. That's one issue to make. Another issue is maybe we should remind ourselves all as well on we talk about food security, and remembering the FAO definition of food security that consists of very different modules or puzzle parts. And that is reflecting a bit what Leonard said. So that's a bit up to the individual country. Where are the relevant parts to be taken? So the FAO says it's first availability of food, which can be own production, which can be import as well, which even can be aid in terms where that is relevant. So it's not actually important regarding to this definition, where's the origin of food. The next one is access to food, and that does not mean infrastructure, but as well price levels, which could be lowered via trade. And it's as well income level, which is part of a whole social policy approach. And the third aspect is usability. That means it's not only relevant to have food, but as well to have energy to prepare food, and water to produce food, and as well to prepare food. And the fourth dimension is stability. What I wanted to say is there's a huge range of possible bits one has to choose in a policy choice. And I support very much what Leonard says, not in the terms of it's only up to you / Africa to do something. To put it the other way around, it's of course your sovereign policy decision to do so. So actually, yes, you should find a good policy mix. And the final comment I would like to make, what you said, is it against the European companies' interests? Well, let me start with that. The African continent, economic-wise, is a huge market. And I would say there's enough place for different products, different segments, and so on. So even after a regional market has been established there, of course, there will be certain specialized European products which African consumers would love to have, and the European consumers still would love to have certain African products. I would not say so. It's against the interest, actually. It's a huge market, and we could find all our segments, and the population grows, and hopefully the income grows in Africa anyhow will tend to a different consumption pattern, still allows for European business to enter the market. I stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Evelien or Leonard, maybe you want to?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we should be really careful with an approach of liberalization of trade in general, because it doesn't, it only reinforces a system that is highly unequal and doesn't take into account the huge power imbalances between different countries and agri-food companies. And so we've seen, particularly from the EU, that or countries, governments, EU governments, that there was a major focus of low-income countries to push low-income countries to focus on exporting one particular item and towards global value chains. So a lot of low-income countries have specialized and made them therefore even more vulnerable to the global shocks that we're seeing right now. And this has also come at the detriment of local food production. So I think we need to be very careful in trying to reinforce that and trying to make these countries not even more vulnerable to price increases and shocks. So one of the solutions is for the EU to really support countries in reinvesting in their local food capacity, and also for African countries to really invest more in agriculture. We see that only 4 of the African countries are investing 10% of their national reserves to agriculture, whereas it should be all according to the Malabo commitment. So there's also really a need for African countries to reinvest in agriculture and to make sure that African countries are much less dependent on the international food market and can produce the food that they need for their own citizens.
Thank you, Evelien. I do agree also with that. The liberalization of trade has casualties, no? That's happened also in Europe. And I was wondering about what could the producers in Kenya of maize think about the maize coming from Uganda, no, being much cheaper. So let's move to Leonard.
Yeah, just so that we give the opportunity for some Q&A. I still have NGOs, maybe not Oxfam, but others, who say trade should be restricted. We are now using more food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is not stopping trade across borders. This would be suicidal. We saw it in COVID. Clearly, Africa, through the African Continental Free Trade Area, has the policy space to decide how to adjust flows. But with the amounts of intra-regional trade that Africa has today, and what Elizabeth made clear, there are massive barriers of all kinds. Strategic corridors that we are trying to support, this will take time, but there are lots of barriers of a technical nature, of an SPS nature. Markets are not integrated. And Elizabeth comes from one of the regions which is technically the most integrated, EAFF, the Eastern African Community, let alone the rest. Central Africa, CEMAC, not at all integrated. ECOWAS, not bad. But this is Africa to decide what it wants. The role of Nigeria in ECOWAS. What policy space? Let's be clear and open of what Europe can do and what Africa needs to do. And intra-regional trade is key. And I know Africa has a strategy agenda 2063, fine, but we can't wait until 2063. Because until 2063, if it's a business as usual approach, you will never achieve 30, 40, 50, 60% integration. But 30, 40, 50, 60% integration means that countries needs to sit around the table and implement the continental free trade area. Implement it. No more talks, no more conferences. You implement and we move on. Then the question of value chains is important, and I agree with Evelien. It's not only cocoa, coffee, and cotton. In fact, there's no much cotton actually. It is local food systems for local and regional markets. And there is still space for trade. Don't think that trade, there is no space for European, for Asian companies, the issue, but Africa has to decide whether it should import rice from Asia. I have been in this business of rice. Everyone says I'm going to be self-sufficient in rice. Very few, if any, is self-sufficient in rice. It's easier to source from Asia because no one mentioned the pressures of urban communities who want low, affordable products. That it's easier to source from abroad than from local production systems. Rice being the classical case. So Europe can be in an easier position to discuss with Africa if there is a clear strategy of what we want to do across value chains, including local food systems, diverse food portfolios. It would be music to my ears if African governments or the African Union come and tell me, Leonard, we want to discuss with you a diverse diets portfolio which goes beyond rice, maize, wheat, and soya, and we move on to other products. But this is a strategic political decision that the Africans will need to take. So I think these are the challenges I think that policymakers, us at all levels, because then we can come with our firepower, not only as Commission, but also as Team Europe. That is what I'm trying to convey in CODEF, in all the fora, interinstitutionally, that we come. I just had the Finns today. We can come country by country and say, this is what we want to accompany you. But we can't be in all over the 20 value chains if we want to be impactful.
Elizabeth has told me she wants to react.
Yeah, I want to make a comment, especially on this Africa Continental Free Trade area, and on the point that you made on regional value chains. Talking of intra-Africa trade, I would say it is still low compared to other continents. But again, it's also building on already the ongoing processes within the continent. Leonard mentioned that I come from East African community where we've been having a lot of regional trading amongst the member countries. Trade has been happening, and we know there are also simplified cross-border trade instruments that are already being implemented within the regs. For example, like ESC. We have instruments like the regional food trade balance sheet, for example, that helps us to understand the situation of food within the different countries where we have excess, where we have scarcity. And then it also helps us in identifying the different opportunities available in the food chain. But like I mentioned, some of the non-tariff barriers that have really hindered inter-regional trade, if they are not addressed, then of course Africa Continental Free Trade Area has far miles away to become a reality. But then in the area of the regional value chains, I know Africa Union Commission launched the CAPS initiative, the Common Africa Agriculture Parks, which is an initiative that is supposed to facilitate the creation of agriculture industrial parks between different countries. The initiative has been supported by the different ministers of agriculture at the ministerial summit, but also different partners, the farmers' organizations, banks like Afrexim Bank, institutions like Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa, and all the different other stakeholders in the agriculture space. A comment on whether Africa Continental Free Trade Area is going to be did you call it like a threat to the EU companies that are trading with Africa? For me, I think we look at EU as our friends when it comes to trade, and maybe if I can put it in the farmers' language, we look at you as professional brokers, because when you look at the products that are produced in Africa, talk of coffee, talk of chocolate, talk of coffee, talk of cocoa, and then look at the products that are re-exported to Africa in form of the coffee and the chocolate. Where are these factories? You realize that most of these factories are in Europe. You will find roasting companies in some of the European countries. But if I posed the same question, how many coffee trees are in Europe, or how many cocoa trees are in Europe, it would be probably a different story or topic of discussion. So for me, I see if this Africa Continental Free Trade Area is fully implemented, it's going to create opportunities both for Europe and Africa, because it's not barring Europe from investing, for example, in Africa. So instead of having to export raw products to Europe, why not facilitate a process where European companies can come to Africa, invest in Africa, and have that processing done in Africa? By so doing, it's going to be reducing on the transactional costs, and everyone will benefit.
In Africa.
Yes, will benefit from that deal. So for me, it's just to support each other. It's not about eliminating some of the partners within the value chain, but it's opening another new largest global market, but also facilitating the process of Africans trading with their fellow Africans. Thank you.
I don't want to skip a final question, more political, related to food as a tool of propaganda. There is this rhetoric that suggests that the global players that have been mentioned are trying to take advantage of the current food security, food crisis situation. No? Even some of the African discourses point that the European Union has been a cause of the rising of the food prices due to the sanctions they are imposing to Russia. And so this is also something that's being heard, and it really points out the European Union as a cause of the food worsening of the food security situation. I would like to share to hear your thoughts, so you can share some of these or comment on this more political look at the problem. Can anyone? I think Bettina maybe online. She can. I think we've talked already about this. So Bettina, please.
Yeah, I mean, that's politically a very, very sensible issue. Maybe to start with one fact. So the thing is, sanctions, there's an internationally humanitarian guiding principle saying that sanctions on humanitarian relevant goods like food or like medicines should not be applied. That's a general guiding rule. And actually that is followed. So there are no sector-specific sanctions by the EU or as well from the UN. There's one exception, which is against Belarus. There had been imposed a sanction on Kali fertilizer. That was already before the war. That was because of the stopping of this Ryanair plane from Athens to Lithuania. And this sanction had to be extended to Russia to avoid trade deviation. That's the only exception. So in principle, there is no directly linked sanction. That's the factual side. However, sanctions in general, of course, affect the economic certainty of certain trading. So there is an effect of general trading from the whole region, Ukraine, Russia, towards, for instance, Europe or Northern Africa. The misuse of this narrative is very problematic, and there's, as we know, some African countries contacting Russia in terms of finding new trading deals for cereals to their country, which is understandable, especially in the beginning of the war. So there, how to say, that's linked to what I said in the very beginning. There should be at a high diplomacy, maybe food diplomacy approach between the EU and Africa to clearly communicate, to clearly find solutions, even for unintended risks on food trade, not because of direct sanctions, but the unintended effects, to solve them, trying like a accompanying fund, for instance. Another issue is the grain deal. There we find as well a kind of narrative from the Russian side. The grain deal has two parts. One is the trade from Ukraine to the international market. And the second one is that Russia wants to have its own export supported. And sometimes there are stockings, and sometimes as well private actors, even though there are no sanctions, say, oh, we are not going to trade again or still with Russia. And that can be misused as well by Russia. So there should be a very clear, strong policy diplomacy approach, maybe together with Africa, in order to find out what are your needs, to avoid that there are kind of backward policy tensions. But of course, there are different African countries and there are different sensibilities and interests. And again, that's a sovereign decision. However, that would be maybe a good idea to have there a joint diplomacy approach.
Okay, so
Thank you.
I think, thank you, Bettina. I think we have to open now the floor. Maybe after in the final, you can also comment on this issue, but the floor is now open to any interventions from the audience. Anyone who would take the floor? Yes, please identify yourselves and say who you direct your question to.
Hi, I'm Koen Keizer from ECDPM. Recognizing that we are in a crisis, still a delight to listen to this panel. I got two questions, one about process to the whole panel, and one about sort of an example of a tension between food and climate goals that's more targeted towards Elizabeth and Leonard. To give another number to show the size of the crisis, the UN just launched an appeal for 51.5 billion to avoid what they call the largest food crisis in modern history. It's the largest appeal ever, and it's unlikely that this money is found with the current way that we prioritize the crises. Even though it wouldn't be necessarily gone with peace in Ukraine. Adopting a bit of blue sky thinking, what processes are needed now to sort of go much further in addressing the current food crises? And then over the summer, the Commission opposed sort of support for expansion of African fertilizer production because it was in contrast to sort of climate goals. Given that there's sort of a general agreement on the panel to sort of support African self-sufficiency and food production, isn't the Commission position a bit in tension with that goal? And to put a bit advocate of the devil, kind of short-sighted. I mean, surely there is misuse of fertilizer and so on, but isn't there a general need for more fertilizer input into Africa to expand productivity and to meet its own climate and biodiversity goals? Thank you.
Maybe we can get another question.
Yeah, thank you so much for this interesting panel. My name is Stephanie Arnold. I'm from the University of Bologna, and I'm a PhD researcher focusing on digitalization in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's where my question comes from. So we heard a lot about the obstacles of like regional integration. We heard about the challenges of strengthening local food systems. And I was wondering if there's scope for digital tools. So we know that we have like different startups, we have different technologies that now try to bring farmers closer to the consumers, eliminating intermediaries and possibly yielding higher revenues for the producers, but also lowering the costs for consumers. So do you see a lot of potential there, or do you think this is still a very limited initiative, like in some countries, whereas it's really not taking off in others? Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's a third question coming
yes,
from the online. So, Daniele.
So there is a question from the chat. I will find it back. You can start with
Okay.
answering.
So maybe Leonard, Evelien, you want to? Evelien, go ahead.
Start with the digital. Okay, so clearly digital is part of the solution. And we saw it in COVID. So e-commerce platforms, there are a number of platforms in Kenya, M-Pesa, mobile payments. So the question is, how do you distill what I call, it's not digital hype, but there is a lot of hype around artificial intelligence, for example, blockchains. We want artificial intelligence and blockchains to be part of the transparency agenda, for example, on sourcing and deforestation-free value chains. Geospatial systems, Copernicus. We use these satellite systems also in terms of forest cover. So there is a lot of work on the digital agenda. However, we also see that if there is no connectivity with the small farmers who are actually not always in the big system of benefiting from the transparency remains a bit of a virtual issue. We want digital tools to enhance the transparency in cocoa, for example, so that it's not just 5–6% of the value chain that is extracted, but it's not digital on its own. It's digital plus enhancing farmers' organizations, plus de-risking. It is a whole spectrum. Digital on its own will not do miracles. Finance on its own will not do miracles. It has to be strategic corridors, digital, smart governance issues. It has to be an ecosystem where digital is clearly at the core. To what Koen said, we have to be clear on what we want. If you have 100 euros and you want to invest it, because we don't have unlimited funds, you mentioned 51 billion. Now, from where is the 51 billion coming from? Because let's be clear as well, from COP, okay, Sharm el-Sheikh, how many new billions came? We go to Montreal, how many billions will come? We'll go to another summit. Who has the billions today? I go to the council every month. 8 billion is not going to become 20 billion. We are ring-fenced by the MFF. Unless the parliament and the council come and tell me, Leonard, instead of 8, you have 20. I can work with 20. Instead of 20, you'll have 50. But 8 billion I have to work with in 90 countries, not in 50 countries. And we can't do miracles with the Yemens, with the Afghanistans, we haven't mentioned them, with the DRCs, with the Burkinas, with the Mali. Money is part of the solution, a big chunk. But on fertilizers, that the latest from the African Union is we have been tasked to do another task force, fine. So I will engage with the African Union, with my colleagues across the services, but it will not be synthetic fertilizers at all costs, because, even fertilizer corporates in Africa, OCP, Dangote, and others, have also a vision of not necessarily exporting fertilizers within the African continent. Who is best paid gets the fertilizers. So I didn't say no to fertilizers. I said no to fertilizers at all costs if it's not accompanied by smart soil fertility. There have been. I give you the example of Malawi, country that probably Elizabeth knows. How many billions of money has been spent in Malawi? With what additional productivity increases? If it's not done in a smart way, with a smart governance, if you want to reduce corruption issues between small and commercial farmers, and then it's only maize. What do you do if you want to do soil fertility in a smart way, where you have strong governance with conditionalities? So if you don't, you can't just say the EU is against. It's not the EU is against. The EU is in favor of an approach, because otherwise we don't speak about sustainable agri-food systems, agroecology approach, soil biodiversity, nutrient management, plant proteins, diverse diets. If you don't do this in the landscape, then you will not have smart long-term solutions. You will be in ad hocism, And the last thing we want today is ad hocism, just ad hoc today, and then tomorrow we'll see.
I don't know who had the question prepared before.
Yes, we have two questions. One is for Leonard again, but I think Elizabeth could also reply. What is the role of the EU delegations on the ground to make these policies and projects practical and to deliver effective results? And to Elizabeth, the second question is about the future of Africa. Like Frank Nagel is asking, we know that cotton, cocoa, coffee will always have access to markets and to investments, but how is Africa going to feed itself in view of the rising demographic trends and the need to deliver more food to the people in a continent which is, extremely rising in terms of food demands and population?
Maybe we can start with Elizabeth.
Okay, so I want to start with the previous questions, then I will touch on the new question. And first on the issue of digitization. I would say as farmers organizations and especially EAFF, its digitization is high on our agenda. We have our own mobile initiative called eGranary because we've seen that because of the subsistence nature of the agriculture sector in Africa and especially the Eastern Africa region, there's no way you can have a physical aggregation. So it's important that you use digitization to be able to aggregate our membership for access to inputs in terms of aggregating their demands for certified seed, for certified fertilizer, but also to be able to offer services like extension. When you look at the extension challenges within the region, the ratio in some countries is 1 to 1,800 plus households, of course, which can never be achieved if you are not continue working with our governments in terms of offering extension. So digitization offers another option to have e-extension, but also in terms of coordinating logistics like e-tractor services, post-harvest handling, using common and joint warehouses, but also in terms of access to the market. Once you have data on the production, then you're able to use that data to have access to the market. But what has been the lesson? And I think it's what Leonard touched on, the whole ecosystem of digitization, because we are not talking about just digitization as a component. For example, we've been implementing this eGranary program in 3 countries of Eastern Africa, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. But one of the lessons that we've learned is that we as farmers, we face a lot of competition from the mobile network operators. Organizations like companies like Safaricom's are also offering the same services and targeting the same farmers that we are working with. So in so doing, these are well-established companies with a lot of money, so it really creates a lot of competition. But also, when you look at the policy terrain, in countries like Uganda and Kenya, it's easy to have like a common database of the farmers, but in countries, for example, like Rwanda, you cannot have the data of their farmers out of the country, meaning then you have to have a whole infrastructure set up on the database of the farmers in Rwanda, and of course, plus again, other countries. So the landscape is a bit different, of course, from country per country specific, so which calls, of course, for a lot of resources and investments in the digital space. But then, of course, this calls also for a lot of partnerships. It's not easy to do it alone. You have to create a whole ecosystem of different partners that are going to offer services at every part of the different value chain. Then back to the other question on how is Africa going to feed itself. I think it's I don't have a right answer for that, but it's everyone's responsibility to make sure that we produce enough food. If you are not able to produce the food, if you're not the farmer, but then invest in the farmer, how are you going to invest? Make sure that you pay the right value for food. If you can't do that, then the farmer has the motivation to produce more food. But otherwise, there is, I would say, a farmer has, like I said, when you talk of all these challenges that the farmers are faced with, ranging from climate change, all these extreme shocks, who bears the brunt? It is this farmer. And then they have no safety nets. When you look at agriculture sector in Africa, it has no safety nets. The other day, I was invited to speak on agriculture subsidies in Africa. And then I was like, do we even have subsidies in Africa? Because what we see in Africa are not agriculture subsidies, but they are politically driven. You will see them 3 months to elections and maybe just 3 months after elections, and then the whole issue is forgotten. So then now, of course, it leaves the agricultural sector exposed to all the shocks, and it's these farmers that are exposed to all these shocks. So if we can have agricultural safety nets for the farmers, if we can pay the true value for the food that is produced by the farmers, then I believe farmers would be motivated to produce more. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe Evelien, can you give us a final key message in 2 minutes so we can make this final round and finish on time? No, about some final takeaway or important message that you would like to add, and then.
Yeah, and I want to link that to the question that was posed about the funding. It's absolutely right that the humanitarian needs are bigger than ever, and there's just no way to pay for that. And we also see that the humanitarian system is completely unable to deal with all these different crises that are becoming more protected as well as they go along. So yes, we need to increase humanitarian aid and we need to invest in that. But what's more important even is to start earlier and to really invest in sustainable development is something that I said before as well, including anticipatory action for all these different shocks. And Leonard was already mentioning that there's no leeway in the current MFF. The parliament is, well, some of parliamentarians are willing to open up the MFF and see if there's more funding for the development and humanitarian side, but it's particularly the council that doesn't want to do that. So that's a problem, and we need to all invest in that and see if we can convince EU member states to support this and to add more funding to the system. But at the same time, we also saw that the previous MFF, so the previous budget of the EU, had a dedicated section to focus on nutrition and sustainable agriculture. It was almost 9 billion, or 20% of the previous MFF. In the current MFF, we don't have that. We don't have that marker. There are many other markers, but not on agriculture and sustainable agriculture and nutrition. And we think that that is really crucial. It's also something that Elizabeth said before, to really invest in agriculture in the long term, in sustainable agriculture. So hopefully with the revision of the, or not the revision, but the review of the MFF that's coming up, we can fix that. And that's really something that we as Oxfam find very important. But I see Leonard nodding as well. So maybe that's something also that can be done from the inside.
Thank you, Evelien.
Ainhoa, before I give the floor to Leonard, there is just one quick comment from the audience, so then they can reply and close the panel.
Okay.
Is it okay, Leonard? It's okay? Okay. Thank you very much, colleagues. I'm Sandra Parson. I work in the EAS. I was posted to Malawi and Uganda. So obviously this debate resonates a lot with me. If you don't mind, I would just try to throw in my perspective, and please then continue, because I do think this is a very, very rich discussion. You said earlier, Leonard, that the question might be value chains 15 or 2. And I was briefly discussing this with my colleague who has also been ambassador in Africa. And both of us kind of felt like this could be very dangerous if we narrow it down to 2. Because I think monoculture is what was done in the 60s. It has very bad connotations, I think, politically. It probably would not be in the interest of, diversification of food patterns and so on. We have a huge problem of stunting in Africa. So diversification, I think, is done for economic, but also for nutritional reasons, and also moving away from the bad connotation of the past. But that's another debate. I wanted to say also that because the question has been what can delegations do, and as I have served in 3, I think I can speak on that. I see my colleague is now back also. I think what delegations can do, of course, it depends on what is being agreed with the host country. So it is impossible for the EU delegations to come in and, you know, decide unilaterally what they think should be done. All these programs are done in partnership, and the funding, of course, is then following those priorities. So that is a very important thing. From my experience, as I said, both in Uganda and in Malawi, there is a degree of corporatism that also is very prominent in the agricultural sector. So even if you would, for example, say that the production of, let's say now, tobacco is not, you know, future oriented or is not, you know, a priority, etc. It could be, and I'm not saying that this is what I saw, but it could well be that, you know, on the other side of the table, one would say, well, no, well, this, and I think we should continue with tobacco. So that is one thing that we shouldn't overlook, that there are vested interests, as we call them, there's corporatism. But on the other hand, and this is a very sensitive topic, but nonetheless very true, is that there are also political interests in some countries where, you know, one would not want to go for industrialized agriculture and so on, but where it suits certain groups very well to keep small farmers into small farming. Let's rest my case, and I'm very, very sorry to intervene, but I thought this discussion was so important and so rich. Thank you.
I can't not agree on what our colleague from EAS said. Clearly, I didn't speak about vested interest on anything that we do in our core business, from fertilizers to typology of seeds, to typology of policies, to where we need to head. However, we need, and this is the role of delegations, and I always tell my farmers' organizations, you're first in a geographization context of this MFF. As a portfolio, my unit has a very small portfolio of global public goods, okay? Most funds, 80% of funds are geographized, meaning that the game is being played at country level. You need to first knock at the door of our delegations, and we will facilitate our delegations to engage with you. So that is first. I am not going into monoculture, clearly not. But the question is, if I take a look at the Uganda portfolio, I have 15 components. That is my problem. I can't do impact. My political masters are telling me, Leonard, if you want to be the gazelle in food systems transformation, you can't do 2 million here, 3 million here, 5 million here, and be impactful. So that is my challenge. Do we do business as usual? Because I can do business as usual. I do a bit of everything, because Elizabeth is saying clearly that a country like Uganda needs a bit of everything, clearly. But what can we do with a bit of everything if we want to be impactful? And if I were to show you my metrics of what I need to show to be impactful and transformational and gender transformational and youth transformational, I can tell you this is acrobatics, and it's going to be complicated. And then I put the financial institutions, because first of all, not everyone wants to invest in agriculture. We have EFSD plus, fine, but not everyone wants to. Everyone wants to go into renewables, but not in agriculture, because agriculture is tough. It's difficult, it's complicated, it's working with small farm holders. De-risking small ticket sizes is complicated. That's one. Second, trying to choose winners, it's not always easy in value chains. Because, and this brings me to what Koen asked me, if you were to tell me, what would you like? I want that the African continent decides, agrees with the global community where it wants to focus, and comes to the donor community so that we focus. We focus in terms, Elizabeth mentioned, agro-industrial parks. I need to be convinced about the inclusiveness of agro-industrial parks, fine. I don't have the evidence. I know Ethiopia, Senegal are doing agro-industrial parks, but inclusiveness, how is the multi-stakeholder approach of inclusiveness in these parks? But then how to have a critical mass of the competitive and comparative advantages of the African continent across commodities, across value chains, so that we don't, what I do, drip irrigation, sprinkler across the continent, which will not make economic sense or sustainability sense. If we have that demand-driven agenda of Africa, then the donor community can invest in a smart approach and not do a bit of everything across the 50 countries, because this would not be smart policy making.
Thank you. I will ask Bettina now to make this the final quick and short takeaway, please. Bettina, thank you.
Yeah, I'm tempted now to react on that, but I don't. First, maybe one issue we were not talking about, and which I think it's still relevant because it's besides budget. And it shows a bit if trade not functions very well, what is a problem, and is linked to fertilizers as well, and that are export restrictions. In any type of market crisis, we see that especially large exporters, which is very dangerous then, implement them. And recently we have that still 30 countries are imposing just on food and fertilizer products export restrictions. And this leads to another push on prices. So, and this is an issue that's very difficult to limit. The EU is not doing that in this crisis. It did that a lot in the corona crisis on medical products, but not now on food products. And there are huge declarations not to do so, but still there are 30 countries imposing export restrictions. So there we should continue. It's a WTO issue actually, because the criteria are very vague to limit such trade bans. But it shows if trade is not open, that is really a problem for the price levels and increases a lot of food import bills as well for African countries. From the African side, again, let me stress what Leonard says repeatedly. It's, of course, the sovereignty, and it should be the sovereignty to decide on what way to follow for food security. Remembering again the definition by the FAO, saying there are very different principal options to choose, and one is trade, one is production, and another is imports. So we have, I mean, especially in the EU, we have the experience as we followed a complete self-sufficiency approach 70 years ago, we ended up in a very unfair, let's say, policy as well towards competing countries and towards developing countries. So it could not be the idea to produce each and everything in an own economy. So trade would still always be a part. There's another issue on regional cooperation, not only on trade in Africa, so not only the African Free Trade Continental Area, that could be cooperation on emergency stocks. There were already some approaches in Western Africa under ECOWAS, Réseau Guest, it was called. Another idea is the African risk capacity, which is a complex system of insurance and pooling risks by stocks. That, of course, requires political will across African countries to cooperate. So one could follow that as well for food security to be prepared on shocks. And a final very sensible issue maybe, but as a last point, in the EU, we discuss a lot of different land use patterns regarding food, fuel, feed, and last but not least, the consumption pattern, meat. And what does that require across the whole value chain to use somewhere else in the world land area for feed? There are some consumption patterns maybe in Africa, but again, it's sovereign African decision, but it would be worse to look at. There are, I know best the Northern African countries where the wheat consumption is incredibly high. So there we have 3 times wheat consumption per capita compared to Germany, for instance. And there the question is, could one change that as well internally at an economy in Africa? So is that like here, is it worse that we eat so much meat? And the same is in Africa, is it worse to eat so much wheat and baguette and things like that? One could substitute as well these type of things which require some different production. So diversification can be touched to different parts, trade, production, and consumption. here in Europe, but maybe as well in Africa. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bettina. So what is left is to thank all the panelists and thank also the audience. And we've heard very interesting comments, and I think we've discussed many angles of the thing about food security. So my job now is to close this panel. So thank you very much. Now we go to lunch.